The silent war on the authentic. Have you ever noticed how quiet defiance makes people uneasy? You didn't shout, you didn't protest, you didn't insult anyone or disturb the peace. You simply stood still when everyone else was bowing. You stayed silent when the script expected applause. You refused to wear the mask, and for that alone, the room grew cold. This is the paradox of authenticity, that the simplest expression of it, not pretending, can provoke a storm, not because it harms anyone, but because it reminds them of the roles they've accepted to survive. We live in a world of invisible scripts, from the way we speak in meetings to the way we smile in photographs. Most of what we present is curated, edited, rehearsed. We scroll through pages of images where people don't just exist, they perform, and those who stop performing, who appear without filters, are met with suspicion. Something about the unmasked face feels dangerous. Not all resistance wears boots. Some of it wears silence. Some of it walks into a room, refuses to flatter, and watches the social fabric quietly tense. This kind of resistance doesn't need slogans. It's not rebellious for the sake of rebellion. It's not about attacking others. It's about refusing to abandon oneself. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comment, which country are you watching from? Fascinating to see who is joining us from around the world. Friedrich Nietzsche understood this better than most in his writings. He described the deep discomfort society feels toward the one who steps outside the herd. He called it herd morality, the moral system born not from truth, but from survival, a code created by the many, not to liberate the strong, but to neutralize them. Morality, in this view, isn't a path to virtue. It's a leash disguised as a halalier, rewarded when you conform, praised when you mirror others, but deviate just slightly. Don't laugh at the joke everyone else finds funny. Don't nod along to the opinion that offends your instincts, and suddenly you're arrogant, cold, too intense. You didn't do anything. That's the point in a world where everyone plays along. Not playing is interpreted as violence, because to be truly yourself, unscripted, unashamed, untamed, is to reveal how much of everyone else's performance. Obedience has become the religion of the modern era, but unlike past religions, it doesn't demand confession or ritual. It demands a smile, a nod, a compromise, and the more invisible the demand, the more dangerous the refusal becomes. Today's blasphemy is authenticity, and when you choose it, not as a brand, not as a gimmick, but as a way of existing, you don't need to attack the system. You simply walk out of the room. You stop needing the applause. And that alone is enough to make people hate you, because in that moment, you become the one thing every obedient soul fears. A reminder that freedom still exists, and that they gave it up. This isn't about rebellion. It's about returning to the self, returning to that strange and dangerous place where truth lives not in agreement, but in solitude. That is where our journey begins. The myth disguised as virtue. From our earliest memories, we are trained to associate obedience with goodness. The quiet student is praised, the disruptive one scolded. The child who follows orders earns rewards. The one who questions them earns detention, suspicion, or silence. In these early rituals, a mythology takes root, that to obey is to be moral, to deviate is to be dangerous. But morality, like all things human, has a history, and history, when examined honestly, reveals that many of our so-called virtues were never born of love, but of fear. Friedrich Nietzsche called this slave morality, a system of values created not by the powerful, but by those who felt powerless. In the ancient world, strength, boldness, and excellence were admired, but as those without power grew in number, they created a new moral framework, not one that celebrated greatness, but one that condemned it. They called pride a sin. They renamed ambition as arrogance. They took what they envied and made it immoral. The result was a reversal. Now humility was good. Submission was holy. Meekness was divine, not because these Traits were noble, but because they neutralized the threat of those who refused to kneel. This framework found fertile ground in institutions. Religion sanctified obedience, education demanded it, military hierarchies perfected it, corporate culture rewarded it, and all the while, society praised the well-behaved, the ones who didn't ask why. But what is obedience really? It is not the absence of violence. It is the redirection of power. Obedience is not peace. It's a surrender dressed as harmony. Imagine a child in a classroom, not speaking out of turn, not disrupting the lesson. But then, they ask a question. The curriculum doesn't want to answer, not a joke, not a rebellion. Just a thought that deviates. The teacher frowns. The class goes quiet. The child is labeled difficult, not for being wrong, but for being unpredictable. Now imagine the adult version of that child. A whistleblower in a corporation. They don't steal. They don't deceive. They simply refuse to go along with a lie. They don't comply with the silence that everyone else has accepted, and so they're fired, shamed, or forgotten. Not for breaking the rules, but for questioning who made them. This is the myth of obedience, that it is synonymous with morality, that the well-trained are somehow more virtuous than the honest. But in truth, being good often just means being easy to manage. The obedient are praised not because they are better, but because they are safer, predictable, controlled. Nietzsche didn't just attack blind obedience. He attacked the illusion that obedience is neutral. He saw that it serves a function to protect systems, not individuals. It maintains hierarchies by ensuring that no one asks whether those hierarchies deserve to exist. And so, we live in a world where the disobedient are punished not for their cruelty, but for their clarity. Their refusal becomes a mirror, one that reflects the quiet desperation of those who've mistaken submission for virtue. What if the heroes we were taught to admire, the compliant, the polite, the well-adjusted, were simply those who never challenged anything? And what if the villains, the difficult, the defiant, were merely the ones who saw too much? In the myth of obedience, goodness is obedience, but in reality, obedience is often the price paid to survive in a world afraid of truth. There is something primal about the discomfort people feel in the presence of difference. It's not always shouted or explicit. Sometimes, it's a passing glance, a raised eyebrow, a nervous laugh that fills the silence when someone dares to say what others are thinking, but too afraid to voice. That unease isn't always conscious. It's deeper, older, because before morality, before religion, before society, there was the tribe. In our earliest evolutionary history, survival depended on cohesion. The tribe was safety. Straying from the group meant exposure to predators, to starvation, to death. And so we evolved a mechanism, a deep biological instinct, to stay close to the herd, to match its tone, to follow its rhythm, to conform, not because it was right, but because it was safe. Today, that instinct lives on, but not in jungles or savannas. It echoes in office meetings, in classroom silences, in the anxious pauses before someone hits post. Conformity has become a form of social camouflage and difference. That's danger, not physical, but psychological. When someone refuses to obey, not violently, but peacefully, they disturb the equilibrium. They challenge the invisible contract everyone else has signed, and in doing so, they force others to look at themselves. Why didn't I speak up? Why do I still pretend? Why am I still here? Erich Fromm, in Escape from Freedom, wrote that most people do not flee chains. They flee choice freedom. True freedom is terrifying. It requires responsibility, autonomy, a willingness to bear the burden of one's own judgment. And so, many trade that freedom for structure, for roles, for comfort. They become obedient, not because they believe, but because believing is easier than thinking. But when someone lives freely, when they walk away from the script, refuse to laugh on cue, or simply say no, they become a mirror, one that reflects the compromises others have buried. That reflection is not welcomed. It is hated, not because it is wrong, but because it is true. This is the psychology of resentment. You see it in small things, in whispered judgments about the person who quits a stable job to pursue something risky, in the gossip that surrounds someone who doesn't dress appropriately, in the subtle disapproval when someone questions a popular narrative. These aren't acts of evil. They are symptoms of fear, fear of authenticity, fear of those who no longer ask for permission. Nietzsche saw this dynamic clearly. He described a new archetype, not of the rebel or the tyrant, but of something worse, the last man. This isn't a villain. He is kind, polite, safe. He avoids conflict, avoids risk, avoids thinking too deeply. He surrounds himself with comfort, avoids all suffering, and calls that a good life. But he is not free. He is anesthetized. The last man represents the end of striving, of aspiration. He mocks greatness, distrusts passion, and above all, he fears the individual who still dares to rise. Why? Because that individual makes him feel inadequate, not in strength or talent, but in spirit. The one who dares to live freely reveals what the last man gave up, and in return, the herd offers the one thing they still control: rejection. Not with violence, that's too loud. Rejection comes in whispers, in exclusion, in the cold withdrawal of community. It comes in veiled condescension, in polite concern that cloaks resentment. The individual is not attacked for being cruel. They're attacked for being unapologetically themselves. The herd does not punish those who lie to fit in. It punishes those who refuse to lie at all. This dynamic doesn't just play out in dictatorships or rigid ideologies. It's in everyday life, in passive-aggressive remarks, in online outrage, in unspoken social rules about what can and can't be questioned, what should be celebrated and what must remain silent. The instinct to belong is powerful, and the threat posed by a free individual isn't that they are dangerous. It's that they show everyone else how imprisoned they are. Nietzsche understood that obedience was rarely about morality. It was about comfort, predictability, control, and those who disobey, even silently, break that control simply by existing. Herd does not hate the wolf for being vicious. It hates the wolf for refusing to be a sheep, and so, the truly free are often alone, not because they chose solitude, but because their presence makes others uncomfortable, not because they seek superiority, but because they refuse to perform inferiority. Their existence is a quiet revolution, a dangerous reminder that obedience is not safety. It is sedation, that the herd is not family. It is a mechanism, and that the individual, the one who chooses the harder path, who embraces discomfort, who risks misunderstanding, is not a threat to humanity. They are its hope, but only if they can survive the exile. The emotional cost of nonconformity. There is a price for not playing along, a quiet, invisible tax that accumulates not in dollars, but in stares, silences, and the subtle way doors stop opening. Society doesn't need gallows anymore. It doesn't need cages or collars. It has something far more effective: indifference. Those who refuse to obey are rarely dragged into courtrooms. They're simply ignored in group chats. They aren't publicly punished. They're just excluded from private rooms. Quiet promotions, long-term plans. They don't die heroes. They disappear as anomalies, and often, they don't even know why. Not all exiles come with passports. Some come in the form of confusion. An artist who once burned with vision now wonders why no one listens. A teacher who speaks truth finds themselves edged out of meetings. A friend who dares to say the uncomfortable thing is met with awkward silence. This is the modern method of punishment. Unspoken banishment. You don't have to be a revolutionary to suffer for disobedience. Sometimes all it takes is not pretending, declining the invitation to gossip, refusing to join an outrage you don't actually feel, saying, "I don't know." When everyone else chants certainty, that small refusal becomes your quiet trial, and the verdict is emotional exile. History is full of prophets who were not killed, they were mocked. Full of thinkers who were not imprisoned, just ignored. Galileo was placed under house arrest. Yes, but far worse was the cold dismissal of his discoveries by institutions that preferred ignorance. Emily Dickinson's genius was recognized only after her death. Nikola Tesla died alone in a hotel room. Ridiculed in his final years, the modern world doesn't crucify its prophets. It leaves them unread, unliked, undiscovered. Nietzsche himself knew this exile well. He wrote truths that cut too deeply, too early. He dismantled morality, peeled back civilization, and exposed the emotional rot beneath social virtue. And the reward? Silence. Critics called him insane, publishers avoided him, friends abandoned him. He died not just in isolation, but with the cruel irony of knowing he had said something real, and that the world wasn't ready to hear it. Only after his mind was gone, and his voice silenced, did the world begin to listen. This is the pattern. It repeats with eerie precision when someone stops obeying, not rebelliously, but peacefully. Their presence unsettles people, not because they are loud, but because they no longer pretend. The herd doesn't recognize them anymore, and what we don't recognize, we learn to erase. Modern nonconformity is punished not with violence, but with void. No one tells you you're wrong. They just stop looking you in the eye. You're not told you don't belong, but the invitations stop coming. Shower, not fired, but your job becomes unbearable. The emotional cost is devastating, because it creates a kind of dissonance you can't articulate. You begin to question yourself. Did I say too much? Should I have laughed along? Was my silence a mistake? But deep down, you know it wasn't what you said. It was that you saw, and you didn't look away. And in a world built on collective denial, that alone is dangerous. This emotional exile is especially cruel because it is almost impossible to prove. There are no scars, no verdicts, just a growing sense of not being wanted, not being understood, not being real in the eyes of others. Many people watching this have paid that price quietly, without knowing why. They thought they were being honest, helpful, principled, but honesty was interpreted as aggression, helpfulness as arrogance, principles as rebellion. And now they feel alone. If that's you, you are not broken, you are not defective, you are simply no longer domesticated. There is a point when a person wakes up. They begin to see how much of their life was shaped by the need to be liked, accepted, included. They trace their decisions, their tone, their smiles, their silences, and realize how often they obeyed without knowing it. Then, one day, they stop, not with anger, but with exhaustion. They just stop pretending, and that is when the world begins to turn on them, not dramatically, but quietly, like an elevator that just stops visiting their floor. This is the cost of nonconformity, and it must be acknowledged, because if we don't name it, we will internalize it. We will think the exile is our fault, that the silence means we were too much, that the mockery means we were wrong. But often, it means the opposite. It means we were seeing clearly in a room full of people wearing blindfolds. That means the opposite. It once wrote, "The individual has always had to struggle to keep from being overwhelmed by the tribe, and what the tribe cannot control. It isolates. To walk the path of freedom is not romantic. It is raw, lonely, often unrewarded, but it is real. And realness is rare in a world of masks. This is not a call to martyrdom. It is a call to clarity. If you've been erased, not because you failed, but because you saw, know this. They didn't reject you. They rejected their reflection in you. And sometimes, the only way to stay sane in an insane world is to become invisible for a while. But invisibility is not defeat. It is preparation. Because those who are silenced often return with something stronger than applause. Vision. A voice forged in silence becomes unshakable, and sometimes the ones the world tried hardest to forget become the ones it can no longer ignore. Morality as a tool of control. There is a kind of morality that does not come from wisdom, but from defeat, not from light, but from shadow. It is the morality of the wounded, the silenced, the powerless, not forged to uplift the human spirit, but to make peace with its captivity. Nietzsche, in the genealogy of morals, called it what it is, slave morality. At first glance, it looks noble, words like humility, meekness, selflessness, obedience, but Nietzsche saw something else beneath their polished surface: resentment. Camouflage and revenge. He argued that Christianity, far from being a religion of transcendence, was the psychological revenge of the weak against the strong. In a world ruled by power, the powerless could not fight back physically, so they rewrote the story. They said that strength was wicked, ambition was prideful, and suffering was sacred. They inverted the scale of values, and in doing so, made their chains into virtues. If I cannot win, I will make winning evil. If I cannot rise, I will call rising sinful, and if I must kneel, then kneeling must be holy. This inversion wasn't just spiritual, it became institutional. Churches blessed obedience and called it divine. Kings enforced doctrine and called it peace. Institutions learned that the best way to control a population was not through force, but through moral alignment. If people believed they were good only when they obeyed, they would police themselves. They would silence their own doubts. They would smile as they submitted. It was genius diabolical, and everywhere you see it. In the medieval church, branding thinkers as heretics for daring to propose that the earth might move. You see it in empires that criminalized questioning the divine right of kings. You see it in the 20th century totalitarian regimes: Stalin's Soviet Union, Hitler's Germany, Mao's China, where morality was rewritten by the state itself, and deviation was treason. To be loyal was to be righteous, to be skeptical was to be evil. But this isn't just history. It's alive today in classrooms where obedience is praised more than curiosity, in corporations where conformity is called team culture, in media where questioning official narratives is equated with conspiracy. Morality has become a firewall, not to protect truth, but to block it. People repeat slogans not because they believe them, but because they've been rewarded for echoing them. Social currency is given not for insight, but for agreement, and over time, the line between virtue and submission blurs until they become the same. That's when obedience becomes sacred. Rebellion becomes sin. But here's the haunting question: do you believe in your values? Or were you just rewarded for repeating them? Pause and really ask yourself that. What part of your moral compass comes from lived experience, from raw thought, from trial and error, solitude and struggle? And what part was handed to you by teachers, by parents, by culture, and accepted without friction? You were probably never taught to ask where your values came from. That question itself was taboo, because if you start questioning the foundations, the whole building begins to tremble, and that's the fear. If morality is a tool of control, then good and evil are not absolutes. They're assignments, labels used by the powerful or the frightened to keep the world predictable. That's why dangerous ideas are framed not just as incorrect, but immoral, not because they are, but because they unsettle the systems that rely on silence. Nietzsche warned that morality can become a kind of prison, not because we are forced into it, but because we decorate the walls. We call this cell peace. We convince ourselves that smallness is virtue and comfort is enlightenment. But deep down, something breaks. There's a moment, and it comes quietly, when a person realizes that their goodness has come at the cost of their honesty, that their morality has become a costume worn for approval, that they have obeyed not because they were kind, but because they were afraid to be judged, to be cast out, to be called arrogant, selfish, radical. This fear shapes societies. Governments use it, religions exploit it, corporations brand it, all because it works. You don't need to kill rebels if you can convince them that rebellion is wicked. You don't need to ban dangerous thoughts if you can convince people that questioning is shameful. You don't need to use chains when a smile will do this. Is the final trick of morality is control. It doesn't look like domination. It looks like harmony. It speaks softly. It tells you you're a good person for staying quiet. It praises you for being agreeable. It nods approvingly when you repeat what's popular. It never asks if your soul is still intact, and that's the warning Nietzsche leaves us with. That morality, if unexamined, becomes a weapon against freedom, that obedience dressed as virtue is still servitude, and that to live authentically, to reclaim your own values, is to risk becoming a villain in the eyes of the world, not because you are evil, but because you are no longer useful to the lie. There is a certain kind of person who walks into a room and says nothing, yet the atmosphere shifts. No raised voice, no rebellion, just presence, and somehow, that's enough to unsettle the entire space. People glance nervously, conversations tighten, smiles grow artificial. It's as if the mere existence of this person threatens something fragile. That threat is authenticity. Nietzsche understood this. He saw that the one who breaks away from the herd is not just isolated. They are resented, not because they caused harm, but because they revealed a wound that no one wanted to look at. A silent kind of violence. The free individual doesn't shout, but they function as a mirror, and what they reflect is unbearable. A life that could have been lived differently. A life not ruled by fear, a path not guided by approval, a mind not domesticated by obedience. This is the mirror effect, a phenomenon rarely named, but deeply felt. The reason the crowd hates the one who steps out is not because they've done something wrong. It's because their very existence casts doubt on the choices of everyone else. Every compromise, every act of conformity, every quiet betrayal of the self exposed, reflected. And so, the herd reacts, but it doesn't react with debate or curiosity or even aggression. It reacts with dismissal, with mockery, with 1,000 little strategies meant to reduce the mirror back into silence. Look at history, and you'll see it. Everywhere. Socrates didn't die because he threatened the state. He died because he forced people to look at the rot beneath their moral certainty. Galileo wasn't hated because he looked at the stars, but because he refused to look away from what they told him. Whistleblowers aren't feared for what they reveal. They're feared for refusing to pretend. The world doesn't hate truth. It hates the people who refuse to lie because they force a confrontation with our own reflection. The psychologist Carl Jung spoke of the shadow, the parts of ourselves we repress, deny, or project onto others. When someone lives freely, it drags those shadows out into the open. If you've silenced your own curiosity, how do you feel when someone asks dangerous questions? If you've spent years pleasing others, how do you feel when someone walks away from applause? You feel exposed, not because they're judging you, but because, suddenly, you can see yourself clearly. And that's intolerable, because most people have spent their lives building masks, identities made of borrowed values, inherited beliefs, and socially rewarded behaviors. When someone tears off their mask and remains unashamed, it breaks the illusion that the mask is necessary. And that's the emotional economy of the herd, the agreement, spoken or not, that we will not disturb each other's lies, that we will laugh on cue, not in agreement, share acceptable outrage, celebrate acceptable dreams. When someone doesn't play along, it becomes unbearable. They violate the contract, and the punishment is not just social, it's existential. They are marked too proud, too quiet, too intense, too strange, not for anything they did, but for what they refused to be in a society built on performance. Authenticity is a threat in a world addicted to validation. The self-sufficient are dangerous, and in a culture that rewards echo chambers, the independent mind becomes an act of rebellion. The philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre once said, "Hell is other people, but perhaps hell is not people themselves. It's the desperate need to belong to them, to be accepted by them, to be absorbed into their approval, and the one who doesn't need that. They're the most threatening figure of all, because they show a different kind of existence, a life not shaped by consensus, but by conscience, a way of being that isn't optimized for social rewards, but for inner truth." Their mere presence raises the question no one wants to ask. What if I gave my life away for comfort? What if my goodness was just obedience? What if my happiness is a performance? These are unbearable questions, not because they're false, but because they might be true. So, the mirror must be shattered, The free individual must be made invisible. Silenced not by arguments, but by exclusion, not by confrontation, but by collective indifference. A room full of fake laughter grows louder, as if to drown out the one person not laughing. But here's the irony. The mirror never needed to speak. Truth does not require volume. It only requires presence, and once seen, it cannot be unseen. That's why those who live freely, who obey nothing but their own soul, are hated, not because they are enemies, but because they are reminders of courage, of what's possible, of what was abandoned. Nietzsche called them the overman, not because they are above others, but because they have transcended the need for others to define them. They do not conform, they do not beg, they do not explain. They simply exist, fully, dangerously, and without apology. And in their wake, the herd must choose: dismiss the mirror or confront their own reflection. Becoming dangerous. Nietzsche vision of the overman. There is a kind of person the world cannot digest. They do not fit, not because they are broken, but because they are whole in a world designed for fragments. They do not follow, not out of rebellion, but because there is no longer anything within them that needs permission. Their presence does not seek validation. Their life is not a question that waits to be answered by others. They are not loud, not angry, but they are dangerous, because they are free. This is Nietzsche's vision of the Bermensch, often mistranslated as Superman, but more truthfully rendered as the overman, the one who has overcome not others themselves, not a tyrant, not a conqueror of nations, but a conqueror of internal chains. The overman has walked through the wasteland of doubt, through the ruins of false morality, through the desert of loneliness, and emerged with values forged in the fire of their own experience. They did not inherit their truth, they created it. This is not freedom as comfort, it is freedom as burden, the terrifying kind, the kind that demands full responsibility for every breath, every choice, every silence, the kind that does not allow you to blame the crowd, or the rules, or the past, because those things no longer hold power over you. Overman is not immune to fear, but they no longer obey it. They are not indifferent to pain, but they no longer kneel before it. They do not wait for the world to approve of them, because they no longer live within the emotional economy of approval. This is what makes them dangerous, not because they seek to destroy the herd, but because they no longer depend on it. In a world addicted to consensus, the one who moves without it becomes a living disturbance, a kind of earthquake in human form, not chaotic, but tectonic. Their calm is unsettling, their clarity is disruptive. Silence is deafening, because it whispers a truth most try to forget, that it is possible to live without needing to be told who to be. Overman is rare, not because their path is secret, but because few are willing to pay the price of authenticity. That price is solitude, misunderstanding, the loss of borrowed safety. But for the overman, these are not punishments. They are thresholds, markers of transformation, signs that the old self, the obedient self, the self shaped by expectation, has died, and in its place, something entirely new has emerged. A being who no longer echoes, who no longer imitates, who creates. Their life becomes a work of art, not one that seeks applause, but one that radiates a deeper kind of beauty, integrity, wholeness, the fierce elegance of someone who no longer flinches in the face of their own reflection. They are dangerous not because they threaten to control others, but because they inspire others to become uncontrollable. They ignite something silent in those who still wear masks, not by preaching, not by arguing, but simply by existing, because the most powerful form of leadership is not instruction. It is embodiment. The overman does not stand on a stage. They walk among us, often invisible, often ignored, but they carry a light that cannot be dimmed, because it comes from within, and those who are ready to see it, they will not make you feel safe. They will make you feel awake. That is their gift. And their threat, some will admire it, some will fear it, but most will resent it, because to meet the overman is to be reminded of the freedom you once dreamed of, and abandoned. It is to realize that the life you now live may have been built not on truth, but on compromise, and not everyone is ready to see that, so the overman walks alone, not bitterly, not proudly, but necessarily, because theirs is not the path of belonging, it is the path of becoming, and it is not for everyone, but for those who can no longer breathe inside the box, who can no longer pretend that obedience is meaning, who can no longer betray themselves for applause. The path is waiting, it is narrow, it is steep, but it leads somewhere real, and when you reach it, when you taste that dangerous freedom, you will understand why the world hates those who refuse to obey, not because they are wrong, but because they show us what we could have been. The cost and the victory of disobedience. There is a reason most people never step outside the lines. It's not because they lack intelligence or even awareness. It's because they can feel, even before they fully understand, that disobedience comes with a price, a cost that isn't always visible, but is always real. The price of solitude, of friction, of no longer being invited to the table, because you stopped playing the role you were assigned when you refuse to obey. The world doesn't always attack you, sometimes it just forgets you. You're not imprisoned, you're simply unseen, ignored, faded out of the social script, like a background character whose silence was mistaken for irrelevance. This is the first cost of disobedience. Emotional exile, a kind of quiet banishment. You realize that belonging, for many, was never about connection, it was about conformity. They didn't love you. They loved the version of you that didn't make them uncomfortable, and when that version dies, the invitations stop coming. You walk alone now. But what most don't realize is that this loneliness is not the end. It's the beginning, because from this silence, something else begins to speak, something beneath the noise of social reward and punishment, something older, wilder, more honest. Your own voice, it begins as a whisper, the voice that once asked dangerous questions and was shushed into silence. The voice that wondered if there was more than this, and was told to be grateful. That voice grows stronger each day you remain whole. Each moment you choose truth over approval, each time you resist the urge to return to the comfort of the herd, you feel everything more intensely now, the joy, the ache, the beauty, the absurdity. That's another cost, but also a victory. You are no longer anesthetized by obedience. You are awake, and while the obedient are embraced, celebrated, absorbed into systems of praise and promotion, you discover a strange and sacred gift, the freedom of not needing to be liked. The obedient are easy to like. They are predictable, safe, agreeable, but they are also replaceable. The disobedient, those who choose their own path, may never be universally liked, but they are unmistakably alive, and that aliveness, it radiates, it burns, it disturbs, not because it's wrong, but because it reveals how much of society is built on emotional sedation. To obey is to be rewarded with peace, but it is a peace born of compromise, the real kind of peace, the one that sits quietly in the soul, that comes from choosing to live in alignment. Even when it hurts, even when you're misunderstood, even when no one claps. To obey is to adapt to the world. To disobey, when done from a place of integrity, is to shape it. This is the paradox. The obedient survive, the disobedient evolve, and when you start creating from that place, when your life stops being a reaction and becomes a declaration, something shifts. You're no longer waiting to be accepted. You're not trying to escape. Either you're simply becoming not someone better, someone real. Disobedience, then, is not rebellion for its own sake. It's not chaos. It's not anger. It's alignment. A refusal to fragment your soul just to make others comfortable. It's not about saying no to the world. It's about saying yes to yourself. Nietzsche never promised that this path would be easy. In fact, he warned that it would be anything but to live dangerously. He said, is not to court destruction, but to court authenticity, to live on the edge of your own becoming, to throw off inherited values and create your own compass, to stop seeking shelter in identity and begin building a home inside your own being. will lose things, you will lose illusions, you will lose some people. You will lose the quiet reassurance that comes from being just like everyone else. But what you gain in return is worth more than anything you were ever given for free. You gain presence. You gain the ability to stand in front of yourself fully and not look away. You gain the capacity to carry your own silence, your own thoughts, your own contradictions. Without collapsing, you gain depth, the kind that doesn't need to be explained, the kind that doesn't ask for applause. That is the quiet victory of the disobedient. Not recognition, not triumph over others, but a deeper fidelity to life itself. You are not an enemy of the world. You are simply no longer its servant, and that is enough to terrify it, because a single person who no longer obeys out of fear becomes a fracture in the system, a possibility, a beginning, a whisper that grows louder each time someone else hears it and remembers what they once knew, that they, too, were meant for something more than compliance. Nietzsche never claimed to save people. He only asked that they stop betraying themselves, that they live not as shadows, but as flames, that they choose the weight of reality over the safety of illusion. And in his most haunting and liberating command, he left behind not a doctrine, but a doorway. Live dangerously, create your values, obey no one, become who you are, not who they told you to be, not who they applauded, not who they accepted, who you are. Beneath the masks, the training, the fear, that's where the true rebellion begins, and that's where the real life starts. This is end of the story. Thank you for watching. Like, share, and subscribe.